Well, tonight we are grateful to be able to use Zoom webinar for this event as it enables us to broadcast to just about anywhere in the world. And it's an honor to have Randy Newman with us tonight, joining us from the C.S. Lewis Institute in Northern Virginia. Randy Newman is the Senior Fellow for Apologetics and Evangelism at the C.S. Lewis Institute. He has taught at several evangelical seminaries, and after serving for over 30 years with Campus Crusade for Christ, he established Connection Points, a ministry to help Christians engage people's hearts the way Jesus did. He has written 6 books and numerous articles about evangelism. His newest book is entitled Mere Evangelism, 10 Insights from C.S. Lewis to Help Share Your Faith. Randy also hosts a podcast for the C.S. Lewis Institute called Questions That Matter. He earned his Master's of Divinity and his PhD from Trinity International University. And as Randy speaks to us tonight, we welcome you to write any questions you might have about his talk and type those questions at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A tab. And at the end of his talk, Randy will take some time to respond to your questions. But before we get to Randy's talk, I would just like to have us bow in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time tonight. We pray that you, through the power of your Holy Spirit, guide and speak through Randy. Guide us who are on this call tonight to listen, to think clearly and wisely, to ponder, to apply appropriately some of the things that we can glean from a life like C.S. Lewis. May you edify and encourage us to live faithfully and authentically before this troubled world, a world that is so desperately in need of Jesus Christ. And so, Father, to that end, we pray, and in Jesus' name, amen. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you, Gary. It's great to be with you by the world of technology. Good to be with all of you. I've been looking forward to this very much for quite a long time. We live in a time of great technology. I wish you could see this studio I'm in with all of the equipment. We also live in a time of great trouble. I don't think I need to convince you a lot that we're living in a troubled world. When Gary and I first started talking about doing this event, the big trouble we were thinking about was COVID. Well, that was long before a terrible war has broken out, and now we are confronted pretty much nonstop with horrific scenes, and we're wondering how do we find answers in the midst of this? I'm sure you've heard people use this phrase, we're living in unprecedented times. Well, I think we're living during such unprecedented times that the legitimate use of that expression, unprecedented times, is unprecedented. We're faced with so many different trials and struggles and difficulties, and we're trying to find where do we turn for perspective and hope and strength in the midst of this. And the theme of this night's presentation is that there are at least 3 lessons that we can learn from C.S. Lewis about how to handle these difficult times. In fact, I want to say there are 3 lessons that we can learn from C.S. Lewis, and then there's 1 lesson that we must learn. So first, the first lesson that I think we can learn from C.S. Lewis's writings and his life is that we have a proper framework for thinking about troubled times. We have a way of thinking and making sense of the difficulty of what's going on in our world. You may know that Lewis had a great deal of suffering that went on in his life. His mother died when he was only 10 years old, and he looked back at that and said that's when he started moving toward atheism, and he lived as an atheist for quite a few years. He fought and was injured in World War I. His very best friend was killed in World War I. And then he lived through World War II. His radio broadcasts that eventually became the book Mere Christianity were broadcast during World War II while bombs were dropping on England. His brother, Warnie, was an alcoholic and had many times in rehab facilities, and Lewis had to go rescue his brother out of some pretty difficult situations. His wife died of cancer. So Lewis had to grapple with this issue of how does the gospel and suffering connect. He came to faith having to be very, very honest about his own doubt and wrestling with this problem of evil. And one of the very first books he wrote as an outreach book was his book, The Problem of Pain. And he needed to be honest enough and to think deeply enough about his own struggles so that he could admit, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? And then, as only Lewis could say it, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. So Lewis helped us think deeply and to show that the Christian faith helps us grasp, to get a framework of reality, and for us to see clearly that there is a God, and he's a good God, and he made the world a good world, but our world got corrupted by evil. Lewis referred to our world today as enemy-occupied territory. And we have to also grapple with the fact that we are a big part of the problem. Our sin, the very first man and woman's rebellion against God threw things out of whack. And our sin, our individual sin and our corporate sin continues to mess up the world. But then we also have a framework to see that we long for this world to be restored, to be made whole again, and for us to be united to a renewed world. Lewis said that longing, those longings are no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And so Lewis modeled for us how to think rigorously about everything, really, but is certainly about struggles and troubled times and evil and suffering. Lewis, one of Lewis's closest friends, Walter Hooper, said that Lewis was one of the most thoroughly converted men he ever met. And Lewis thought deeply about everything, and he thought Christianly about everything, and we need to do that too about suffering. We have the book of Job to help us tremendously. And I don't know if you've studied the book of Job recently, but given the troubles in our world, this is a great time to go back and revisit that great book and to revisit those lament psalms in the book of Psalms so that we can learn to have a vocabulary about how to express our struggles in the midst of this. By the way, if I can do a little excursus about the book of Job, isn't it amazing how long the book of Job is? Sometimes I think it really could have been a whole lot shorter. It could have been 4 chapters. Chapter 1, bad things happen to Job. Chapter 2, his friends say really foolish things. Chapter 3, God says that the friends said really foolish things. Chapter 4, things got better for Job. Wouldn't that be tidy? Wouldn't that be neat? And I think a lot of us want simplistic answers about very rich and difficult problems. But the book of Job is 42 chapters long. It's not 4 chapters long. And it's designed by God not just to give us answers. Actually, it's kind of disappointing on some of those answers, but to help us wrestle through it. And so since we have this proper framework for thinking about evil and suffering, during this time is a good time for us to think deeply about it. I want to recommend some sermons on the book of Job. One of our senior teaching fellows, Bill Kynes, pastors at Cornerstone Evangelical Free Church. He has a series of sermons from the book of Job. They are deep and rich and troubling and hopeful, all of that, just as the book of Job is. So that's the first point, or the first lesson that we can learn from C.S. Lewis, that we have a proper framework for making sense of it. The second lesson I think we can learn is that we have the power of prayer as a resource in the midst of troubled times. Now, I've wrestled with how to say that so that you're not at this point rolling your eyes or saying, "Well, of course we have prayer, of course." We very often take prayer for granted. And so we need reminders about being diligent and being devoted and being persistent in prayer. And C.S. Lewis can help us a great deal with this. Lewis believed very strongly in the power and the effectiveness of prayer. He used the word efficacy. He talked about the efficacy of prayer. But Lewis never pretended that prayer was easy. He used the word irksome to talk about prayer. He talked about, here's how he said it in one of his writings. An excuse to omit prayer is never unwelcome. When it is over, this casts a feeling of relief and holiday over the rest of the day. We are reluctant to begin, we are delighted to finish. While we are at prayer, but not while we're reading a novel or solving a crossword puzzle, any trifle is enough to distract us. Isn't that true? Lewis tried to write a book about prayer several times, and on a number of occasions he gave up and he quit because he was never quite satisfied with it. He didn't think it really captured the enormity and the power of prayer. Until he decided, he came up with the idea of writing it as a series of letters, very similar to what he did with the Screwtape Letters. And his book, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, it explores richly theologically about prayer, but also about the wrestling and the practice of prayer. Lewis was taken by a statement made by Pascal. Pascal said, God instituted prayer in order to lend to his creatures the dignity of causality. Isn't that a great phrase? The dignity of causality. Sometimes I think when we're going through troubled times, those are the times that we tend to lose heart and give up on prayer. But we must remember, Jesus in his classic Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, he included that phrase that we very often say without thinking all that clearly or deeply. But in the midst of praying for things as small as our daily bread, he also told us to pray for the absolute largest thing we could pray about. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. By the way, isn't that just amazing? But back to back is the smallest thing we can think of, our daily bread, the absolute largest thing, God's kingdom. Implication meaning everything in between. These are things that we should pray about. And some of us get bogged down trying to understand, how does prayer work? How is it that a sovereign God involves people in the advancing of his kingdom? I can't explain it. I don't think we can ask anyone to explain it. But God chooses to use our prayers in the advancement of his will. Isn't that amazing? But it's easy to lose heart. That's why Jesus told a number of parables about prayer. The text tells us when he told one parable, he told it so that we would not lose heart. Colossians 4, verse 2 says to be devoted to prayer, or another translation says, remain steadfast in prayer. And it seems to me that during these troubled times that we're living in a time of war, in a time of disease, in a time of political turmoil, in a time of hostility, that these are times to be more devoted to prayer than ever. Whatever discipline you've come up with for daily or regular times of prayer, my guess is, this has certainly been my experience, my guess is that you'll lose heart, or that you'll need to revamp or restart. And I think during this time is a time for us to not just restart it, but start it with greater urgency and greater regularity. We need to pray for revival in our world. We need to pray for peace. We need to pray for the suffering people in Ukraine. We need to pray for the cessation of evil and war and violence and hatred. And that takes time and that takes energy. And we shouldn't think that it's going to be easy. That's one of the very, very important lessons we can learn from C.S. Lewis, that prayer is work, even if it's irksome work. There's a third lesson that I think we can learn from C.S. Lewis, and that is that we have the perspective of eternity to see beyond troubled times. We have a framework for making sense out of it as best as we can. We have the resource of prayer in the midst of it, but then we also have an eternal perspective to help us see past the troubled times, to see the troubled times in light of a much larger picture. And, Lewis wrote and thought and spoke about heaven a lot. And it put this world into a proper perspective. Jesus spoke about heaven a tremendous amount. He talked about the afterlife, perhaps more than anyone else, or more precisely than anyone else in all of Scripture. Lewis ended his 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia with this vision. You remember this? At the very, very end, he said the end of this whole story was chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. So it is easy, particularly if you spend a lot of time on news websites and seeing the pictures and the videos and reading the stories, to grow hopeless if you're just seeing just this perspective. We need to see this perspective in light of the larger perspective. Now, I want to quickly say this isn't escapism. Lewis wrote this in Mere Christianity. He said, if you read history, you'll find that the Christians who did the most for this present world were just those who thought the most of the next. And so, and he's right, and you can dig in and do some research about history. You would tend to think that some people would be thinking about eternity so they would ignore this world. And I'm sure that's a danger, and some people have fallen into it. But historically, the people who have stuck with it for the long term are the ones who saw this present struggle in light of this larger eternal vantage point. In fact, with an eternal perspective, we have a supernatural empowerment to serve other people in a troubled world during troubled time, to work diligently to eradicate suffering. Tragically, if you studied that same history, you would find people who don't have that eternal perspective quit. They lose heart. They leave. Because it's just so very, very difficult. Trying to help people find food when they're starving, trying to help people with diseases, it's discouraging unless you have a larger framework. One of Lewis's greatest sermons, it's probably my favorite work of all of Lewis's writings, is his sermon called The Weight of Glory. He got that phrase, the weight of glory, from 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. Listen to God's word and feel the weight of these words. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." If ever we needed an eternal perspective, it's now. As we watch the horrific scenes, as we hear about the pandemic still going on and claiming lives, as we grieve about the hostility that people have for one another, we need this eternal perspective more than ever. And Lewis can help us here. Reading his Chronicles of Narnia, reading his sermon, The Weight of Glory, reading Mere Christianity, the more we can listen to his perspective And the more it pushes us to read the scriptures more diligently and to see that perspective in even much fuller language, that can help us. Well, one way this eternal perspective can help us, can change us, is it changes the way we think about other people. It changes the way we treat other people. It reminds us that they are people created in the image of God, no matter who they are, regardless of their background or their beliefs or their lifestyle or their political viewpoints. Being made in the image of God puts infinite worth in every single person. Lewis helps me remember that when I read toward the end of The Weight of Glory. He said this: "The load or the weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it." And then he said two of the most beautiful sentences I can remember reading of his: "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal." And so, if nothing else, these troubled times should alter our schedules. It should change us in the way we spend our time. So to include more time in prayer, more time of studying and reading and meditating on God's word, to more time to take in more information from the scriptures to reshape our perspective and our thinking about people, about ourselves, about God himself, about suffering, about eternity. This is a crucial moment in history. We shouldn't grow, thoughtless about the repeat of the words unprecedented times. They are unprecedented. And so we need unprecedented devotion and discipline in prayer and study and thoughtfulness. Lewis can help us with a perspective, a framework about thinking about suffering, a perspective about eternity, about the power of prayer. But there's one more lesson that we need to learn, and it's not from C.S. Lewis. It's about how God chose to use C.S. Lewis. Lewis was not your standard evangelist. Lewis was not the kind of person you would naturally think would be used by God to sell millions and millions of books. In fact, he didn't even understand it. Lewis thought that 5 years after he died, his books would be out of print and nobody would read them anymore. I just checked on Amazon this afternoon. Mere Christianity is still a bestseller. So here's the lesson that we must learn about how God chose to use C.S. Lewis. We have a sovereign God who is in control, even during troubled times. And we can see this by looking at how God used C.S. Lewis. Like I said, he was not your typical evangelist. In fact, he thought the ideal thing would be if he was part of a two-person team, and he would come in and do the preliminary work, the pre-evangelism, the reason and logic, and then somebody else would come in for the exciting close. And he thought that, well, Lewis was an academic who probably would have preferred to stay in his study and read very, very old books. But God chose to use this one person in absolutely astonishing ways. Here, let me give you just one flavor of this. I'm always intrigued about the formation of that book, Mere Christianity. You may know that they were a series of radio broadcasts, but when it was first decided by the BBC to invite C.S. Lewis to come do radio broadcasts about the Christian faith, they thought that they might be able to get people to listen for 5 sessions. And so they scheduled it for 15 minutes, one evening per week. And so there would be a 15-minute broadcast, and then people could think about it and mull it over. And then 1 week later was part 2. But they planned on only 5. And it turned out that lots of people listened, so they added another 5. But there was a long gap of several months in between the first 5 and the second 5. And they thought for sure they were done then. And but no, the audience was growing to over 1 million people tuning in every single week to hear this man that some people say became the second most recognized voice on the BBC, the first being Winston Churchill. And so they added another 10 or another 12 and then another dozen. And then later it got put together as actually a series of books, but now we have it as one book. But here's what is so intriguing to me when I learn about the formation of Mere Christianity and those radio broadcasts. Lewis's 15-minute broadcast came on the BBC after a 15-minute broadcast of the news in Norwegian. Now, I really hope I don't offend anybody who's Norwegian, but I'm guessing that the vast majority of English people listening on the BBC didn't understand Norwegian. The BBC decided to broadcast the news in Norwegian, in case you're wondering why, because the Nazis had invaded Norway and had shut down all of their radio broadcasts. And so the BBC wanted to make sure that the people in Norway were hearing truth, not the propaganda from the Nazis. And so they broadcast the news in Norwegian for those 15 minutes before. And now it's time to hear from an Oxford Don, C.S. Lewis, talk to us about Christianity. But before the 15 minutes of the news in Norwegian, by the way, there was an amateur variety act that was notoriously bad. These were people who were not known for their singing capability. So 30 minutes of bad music, and then 15 minutes of news in a foreign language. And then on comes C.S. Lewis to talk about the Christian faith. And people listened. I still find that astonishing. One of Lewis's students, and then later a biographer of his, George Sayer, said he was in a pub in London when Lewis came on the radio on the BBC to talk about the Christian faith. And the bartender turned up the volume and then yelled at everybody to shut up and listen to this bloke. He's got some good things to say. And Sayer says in that biography, people did listen for the whole time, listening. And then they talked about it afterwards. So God chose to use this Oxford Don on 15-minute radio broadcasts in ways that are absolutely astonishing. And his books continue to reach people today in absolutely amazing ways. His book, Mere Christianity, was the book that I read as a college sophomore. I took it out of the school library because I wasn't going to go buy the book. And coming from a Jewish background, I hid a book that I didn't want anybody to see that I was reading a book called Mere Christianity. I read it in my dorm room with the door locked. I read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and the Gospel of Matthew, a paperback New Testament that friends in high school had given to me 3 years before. I didn't read it when they gave it to me, but I brought it with me away to college. And in the middle of my sophomore year, with a bunch of difficult, troubled times at that time for me, I took out this dusty copy of the New Testament and I read Matthew and I read C.S. Lewis, and I saw that Lewis convinced me that Jesus was the Messiah. Matthew convinced me that I needed Jesus the Messiah. But there are countless stories about how people have been won to Christ by reading C.S. Lewis. Here's one of my favorites. Maybe you know of this book. It's called Born Again This Way by a woman named Rachel Gilson. Rachel tells a story in her book about being very happy being a lesbian and being involved in a number of different lesbian relationships. And she went off to Yale and only knew 2 people there who identified themselves as Christians. They were 2 girls who were dating each other. And she was beginning to wonder about the Christian faith and ask them questions. Isn't there a conflict between same-sex relationships and Christianity? And these 2 friends said, no, absolutely, it's just a big misunderstanding. And they gave her a packet of information to read, which included a whole lot of Bible verses. And she said that as she read this, the more she read the Bible, the more she thought, no, this isn't possible. And that the Bible is very, very clear that same-gender sexual contact was forbidden. She writes in this book, I felt shame. How could I have been stupid enough to think that there really had just been a millennia-old mix-up? I was angry because I didn't understand. I violently threw the packet of information into the cheap dorm trash can. Not long after that, I was in the room of an acquaintance She was grabbing some item, and as I waited for her in her entryway, I spotted her bookshelf. It featured a small volume called Mere Christianity. The author's name, C.S. Lewis, rang a faint bell, but I hadn't been raised on the Chronicles of Narnia, so I couldn't quite place it. Nevertheless, I desperately wanted to read that book, so I stole it. She stole Mere Christianity and read it, and that's the book God used to rescue her out of her life of sin and brought her into salvation. She now serves on the staff with Cru, Campus Crusade for Christ, as a theological trainer. She's one of the regional leaders in theological development. God has chosen to use the writings of C.S. Lewis and the imagery of Narnia and the almost comic things in the Screwtape Letters to lead people out of darkness and to bring them into light. And so we need to remember that God is in control. This is the most important lesson. Again, not from C.S. Lewis, but from how God used C.S. Lewis. If God used C.S. Lewis, he can use us. He can use people who give somebody a New Testament that they don't open and read for 3 or 4 years after they give it to them. He can use people who say, "How can I pray for you?" So this is a time of us deepening our connection to God in prayer and study and meditation. It's also a time for us to reach out to friends. It's a time for us to talk to people maybe that we haven't talked to in a while. People who don't know this God that we know in this personal, trusting, saving way. We need to ask them how they're handling these difficult times. Where do they find hope? We need to pray for them. We need to tell them we're going to pray for them. We need to ask how we can pray for them. And we need to ask God to give us wisdom about what to say and how to say it. And we need to look to someone far more important than C.S. Lewis. Lewis would be appalled if we were making him our highest standard. No, we need to look to Jesus. And we need to remember what Jesus said. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." May God use us in these troubled times to bring people hope and strength and perspective and even joy. I hope I've saved some time now for some questions and answers. Gary, I hope you have some questions to ask me. I will do my best to answer them as best as I can.
Good. Can everybody hear me now? I'm going to come on with a couple things. Thanks, Randy, for those great insights, particularly from Lewis's life. I know most of the people on the call, that's one of the reasons why they're interested in the subject. And like you said, Lewis would be appalled if he found out how much time we spend sometimes on his life. But I think it's very interesting. I do have one thing while we're waiting for people, if out there, if you're willing to write some questions, more questions into us, we'd appreciate it. In the meantime, what I wanted to ask Randy, because I wanted to ask him, I'm going to kind of give him an infomercial here to tell us a little more about his podcast. And since it's questions that matter, I just wanted to let him give him some time to tell us a little bit about that before we get off tonight.
Well, sure. I love doing commercials. Well, you can find out about the podcast on our C.S. Lewis website, C.S. Lewis Institute website. We produce it every 2 weeks. I invite a guest on to discuss a question that I think matters. And I try to persuade people in listening to it that the question does matter. And it ranges from quite a range from living the Christian life to evangelism to apologetics. I just did a conversation with Trevin Wax about Victor Hugo's great novel Les Miserables, and how does that form us? How does literature and music and art form us and propel our spiritual growth? So please sign up. You'll get notices, I guess, by email whenever we have a new episode. So yes, Questions That Matter is a fun podcast for me to
Good.
do.
Now, I have another question here that I want to ask you, and it kind of is based on your own personal life and ministry. I'm thinking you've been in ministry about 40 plus years, I would assume, after 30 years of being with Crusade, and then so many years beyond that into the 40s, I would imagine. So, first of all, for all that long time, how have you stayed fresh in your faith? And second of all, with that, and think that knowing that scripture and prayer and some of the key things that we talk about as Christian believers and followers of Christ, but has in any way Lewis really encouraged you in some of the things that he wrote about? I know you talked about some of these things tonight, but in what specific ways have you personally, if I can put you on the spot there?
Yes, you can. Although I wish you wouldn't have started with reminding people how old I am. But so I have been in ministry for over 40 years, but I started when I was 3. So no, that's not true. How have I stayed fresh? That's a very interesting question. My first thought is, it hasn't been a steady ride. It's had its ups and downs. It's had its undulations, to use the word that Lewis uses in the Screwtape Letters. I think what has helped me, Lewis and the scriptures, and especially for me, the study of the Psalms, have shown a tremendous amount of honesty that we need to have about ourselves and before God. For a while, I think in early days, the kind of Christianity I was exposed to was very victorious and talked about great victory. And I found that I had a lot of struggles. And what I found is that kind of struggle is a very part of the reality of being a Christian living in a fallen, troubled world. So Lewis's honesty about himself was very, very helpful for me. The scriptures, the Psalms, especially the honesty. Paul's honesty in 2 Corinthians about afflicted but not crushed, perplexed but not despairing, cast down but not forsaken. That kind of honesty has been very, very helpful. And then to see how the gospel meets us in powerful ways in the midst of those difficult times.
That's good. That's great. Okay, I'll give you another question here. It comes in here. Somebody said, Randy, explain pre-evangelism to us and why that matters in our culture.
Sure. I did mention, did I say pre-evangelism? I think I did. I write about it a lot, and I talk about it a lot. It seems to me that Lewis was an absolute genius about it. There are conversations we need to have before the conversation of the gospel. There are things we need to talk about so that when we start talking about knowing God in a personal way, those kinds of topics make sense to people. And so Lewis, in Mere Christianity, spent several weeks just talking about how do we know anything? And don't we all have a sense of right and wrong? I mean, that's how he began the very first broadcast, the very first words of the book, where we've all heard people quarreling. And then he talks about how we all have this sense of right and wrong. Hey, that was my seat. You shouldn't have taken my seat. Or I shared with you. Why aren't you sharing with me? And so he spent several weeks just thinking about a sense of right and wrong, and that we all have this sense inside of us of right and wrong, and yet we all fail to live up to it, up to the standard. I think there's one place after the 4th radio broadcast, toward the end, he said something like, don't think I'm moving faster than I am. I'm still not 100 miles near the God of the Bible. Or the God of Christian theology. So we need to have conversations with people about what they believe and what are their presuppositions and what are their longings and what are the things that they love, and then show how that points to a relationship with God. If I could say a little more, it's wonderful to study the different ways Paul preached in different settings in the book of Acts. So in Acts chapter 13, he's in a Jewish synagogue, and he doesn't have to spend much time defining what he means about God, because they already believed in God. That's why they were in a synagogue. They were worshiping God. And he didn't have to argue that we know truth from the scriptures. That, again, they were religious Jewish people who were coming to worship. So he could start with, here's how God revealed himself through Israel and the prophets and pointed to the Messiah, and Jesus is the Messiah. But you contrast that to what he did on Mars Hill in Acts 17. He spoke for a long time to these secular philosophers about truth and how we know truth and where do we see glimpses of truth in their secular poets. And I think our world today is a lot more like Athens in Acts 17 than Pisidian Antioch, a synagogue in Acts 13. So pre-evangelism are the kinds of things that Paul did in Acts 17.
Okay, here's another one from an anonymous attendee.
Mhm.
How can we reconcile Jesus's words about his yoke and burden being light, and in the face of terrible hardships suffered by, for example, the persecuted church around the world? I've always been confused about the contrast between his words and the suffering of many in his church.
Mhm. Um, uh, you didn't promise, Gary, that we would answer all the questions, did you? So can we just skip that one? That's a tough one. No, I'm sorry. I can't do justice to that question because it's a very, very important and rich and deep question. I can only scratch the surface. But we do have to look at what Jesus said and marvel that he called it a yoke and a burden, which implies heaviness, I think, and difficulty. And yet he also said that it was easy and light. And when you hear stories of people going through persecution, very often you hear about a sense of, yes, it's a burden, yes, it's heavy. And yet the presence of God in the midst of that gave people a sense of joy and hope in the midst of it. It's absolutely astonishing. And I think that's the amazement of the gospel, of people who are going through persecution, and yet they can, just the way Jesus said, not my will, but thy will be done. And they can look to the one who is eternal and find hope in the midst of it. Um, it's a question we're going to have to be dealing with more and more because Jesus did promise that we would be hated and we would be persecuted. As time gets closer to his return, that kind of persecution is going to increase. For those of us who have lived in America, that this may be brand new lessons for us, but it shouldn't be new because Jesus talked about it quite a bit. It's kind of the gospel. I don't want to. I want to say irony, but that's not the right word. It's this duality of the gospel. It's such good news, but it's only good news if we realize the bad news about how lost we are. And it's good news of salvation that comes out of the death of a Savior. He suffered so that we could live eternally. He experienced separation from God so that we wouldn't have to. It's mind-boggling. It's amazing. Peter says that it's so amazing that even angels long to look into it. I'm afraid that may be all I can do in this setting. I do recommend Dane Ortland's very, very good book, Gentle and Lowly. He writes a whole book built around those verses of Jesus saying, "I am gentle and lowly, but my burden is light." And it's a magnificent book. It's very recent, but I think it's going to be a classic in the Christian world. So maybe we could add that. I think we're adding it as we speak as a link because it's a very, very very encouraging and helpful work, but very realistic and honest as well.
Good suggestion. Okay, Charles here asks, of the 7 Narnia books, which one do you think has the most valuable lessons for the time in which we are now living?
Ooh, ooh. I don't know. um, choosing which book of the Narnia books is best. I like them all. I'm sorry. Uh, that's hmm, boy. Isn't this a disappointing moment in tonight's program? I'm really sorry. Maybe the magician's nephew. Is that right? Is that what it is? Magician's nephew? Um, but you really should read them all. You can buy them, by the way, as just one book, and that's the way I like to read them all. Is just so it just flows. But I'm sorry, I hmm. Maybe that sounds like a questions that matter podcast topic, and I'm going to invite somebody on who will know the answer because I don't, and then I'll ask them questions and they'll tell me. So
Here's another more formal question to you. It says, Reverend Newman, you talked about the power of prayer. You get no argument from me on that. But what I would like to know is what is your stance on praying the imprecatory Psalms, if done properly?
that's a topic that's come up a lot lately in the last 5 weeks. And people are not just asking it in theory. They have a particular person in mind that they're wondering about praying. For those of you who are not familiar with that wonderful word, imprecatory, it's those psalms where the psalmist calls down God's judgment to strike certain people dead. Lewis does dig into this a bit in his book, Reflections on the Psalms. I'm a little nervous about praying those prayers very specifically, but I'm not resistant at all to praying, God, work to eradicate evil and stop evil and stop violence. And I would rather leave that up to God as to how he would actually go about doing that. Now, maybe that's wimping out. I don't know. I should have prepared this. I should have anticipated this question. It does seem to me that there is a legitimate basis for praying for God to punish evil. And but we do have, we stand looking at those imprecatory psalms from the other side of the cross, and we look at a Savior who paid the price for evil. And so I think we can pray that God would pour out his wrath on people who are not saved and need the wrath poured out on Jesus, but leave God to work out the mechanics of that. But I do think we should be praying more diligently. Lord, end this violence, end this war, end this evil. And those are the very prayers we need to pray. And I think reading through the Psalms and those particular Psalms can help propel us in our prayer, and they can help us not lose heart, because it does seem to me that we're still going to see lots of very, very dark and difficult days ahead.
Yes, I agree. Okay, here's another question from Glenn. Many are pointing to the war and violence and the pandemic as evidence that there is no God, only blind, pitiless indifference. How would you respond?
Well, I might go back to that quote that I read earlier about Lewis. How did we get the idea that there is such a thing as evil unless we have a knowledge of something good? And so we see evil, we see the pandemic, we see war, and we could conclude, well, there is no God and there is no purpose and there is no meaning. Or we could conclude that there is a God and he is in control, but he is allowing evil, and he has done something about evil, sent his son to die on the cross. But either way, I'm left with an incomplete answer. It just seems to me that the Christian answer has more validity to it, because, like Lewis pointed out, if there is no God and there is no purpose and there is no meaning, why are we so disturbed by the evil that we see in the world? Let me do a short little thing about the problem of evil. This shouldn't take long. I'm probably the only one laughing right now. Okay, so I've wrestled with this too tremendously. This was the issue that was the roadblock for me coming to faith. When I said that I started reading Lewis and started reading the Gospel of Matthew, it was at a time that a friend of mine had died in a very tragic accident. And that propelled me to start digging in and reading. I've wrestled with that issue ever since. Even 40 plus years after becoming a Christian, I still wrestle with that issue. But what I find is there's really only a handful of different ways that people have been able to deal with this issue. There's a Christian way, there's an atheist way, there's an Eastern mystical way, there's a Jewish way. There's probably only a half a dozen different ways. And they're all incomplete, and they all have a certain level of frustration. But it seems to me that the Christian answer is the best. It seems to me that the atheist answer is the worst. It doesn't take into account the reality of why there is joy and goodness in the world, and it leaves us without any hope whatsoever. The Christian answer, I'm sorry, let me back up. We need not just an answer to the why question. Why does a good God allow evil and suffering? We also need an answer to the how question. How do I get through it? How do I find strength in it? How do I find hope? And that's where I think the Christian answer, which has as its center God sending his son to die for the sin of evil people, and then overcoming evil and death with the resurrection, and granting eternal life to those who are saved. So the Christian answer, while I still have frustrations when I see terrible suffering going on in the world, the Christian answer, I think, is far better. It's the best of the incomplete answers, and it's far better for giving us strength and hope and sustenance in the midst.
Ricky was wondering if you could he said, point me to any resources that speak of Lewis's view of the sacraments, if any exist.
Well, mostly Lewis stayed away from some of those topics. He wanted to look at things. He coined that phrase "mere Christianity," and he wanted to talk about things that Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants of a variety of denominations had in common. So he tended to stay away from that. He does talk about it a little bit in some of the later chapters of Mere Christianity, and you can find some other thoughts he had about it in his letters. A lot of people have said that this is actually a weakness of his body of work, and I would tend to agree. I don't think he wrestled deeply with what's really taking place when we celebrate the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. And so I think we need to dig in deeper. We need to find somebody else to help us more than Lewis does on those issues. I think one of my favorites who would be J.I. Packer. I think he digs into those issues more. I also like what Wayne Grudem has written in his systematic theology. That might be a little heavy for many people, but I think Packer would be a good place to start. I think that's all I can recall right now about Lewis and the sacraments.
Here's a very basic question. It's a good one. What C.S. Lewis books should a new Christian read?
Well, I'm assuming the person means in addition to reading the Bible. So, second in importance to reading the Bible would be, I do think Mere Christianity is a great place to start. I think so, especially the first two. It's broken up into four major sections. He calls them 4 books. The first 2 books, I think, are very, very helpful and important. Where else would I go for someone new to the Christian faith? C.S. Lewis. I'm not sure. I really do like. There's the sermon that I mentioned, "The Weight of Glory." It's in a collection of essays that I think is very, very good as a good kind of grounding about thinking. That's not necessarily an easy book to read, but I think that's a good spot. I do think the Screwtape Letters is brilliant and really, really good. It's a difficult read, and but I think it explores how to live the Christian life. You just have to know that you're reading the book from the complete opposite side of things. The Screw Tape Letters is a series of letters of supposedly between two demons, a senior demon and a young trainee, and they're writing about how do they mess up Christians. So it comes at it from the exact opposite and demonic side of things. So some of you may find that too dark and too difficult. I don't know what it tells you about me, but that's my favorite of C.S. Lewis's books. That's a sad statement. I will say that after Lewis finished writing all of them and publishing them, he got lots of requests to write more letters, and he declined every time and said that it was writing that came very easily to him, but it was also very upsetting and it was very disturbing. And so he didn't want to add to it, even though he got requests for more. So I think those are good places. I can't resist doing a commercial. We have lots of resources on our C.S. Lewis Institute website for new believers, and things that would be, I know this sounds crazy, that I would say we have things that might even be better than C.S. Lewis at the C.S. Lewis Institute, but I'll see if I'm going to get fired tomorrow.
Here's another question from Dean. While many get angry at God about evil, how do you address the opposite problem of indifference and numbness with friends and
Yes. Oh, it's very easy to get numb in our world today. We're bombarded with so many things that we lose our ability to feel. And there's research being done that the more divided we are with technology and getting so much input, we become less capable of empathy. So it's a very, very serious problem. And what I think we need is regular, steady times of disconnecting from our phone, from the internet, from everything other than quiet and prayerfulness and the scriptures. And we need to pray that God works in our hearts so that we don't become cold and callous. I don't think we can manufacture it. I don't think we can just remind ourselves of a few Bible verses and then presto changeo, we become compassionate people. We need to ask God to work in our lives to change us. A very important part of this is meditating and reflecting on God's kindness towards us in the gospel, in what Jesus did for us. We need to preach the gospel to ourselves with depth and meditation so that it breaks our heart, and we stand amazed that God would choose to call us his child. And that takes time, and that takes meditation and reflecting. I'm regularly struck by Paul's letter to Titus. Titus was a mature Christian man. He was a pastor. He was a leader. He had been a Christian for a long time. And Paul wrote Titus a letter. And at least 3 different places in that very short letter, he unpacks the gospel. He reminds Titus of things that Titus already knew. In chapter 3, there's a lengthy restating of the gospel. At one time we were foolish, disobedient, deceived, enslaved, but God saved us. And he's saying this to a man who already knows this. But the implication is we never get to the point where we outgrow the need to preach the gospel to ourselves and remind ourselves of how lost we were and how graciously God saved us. And that can melt our hearts and make us more compassionate. But again, it won't be automatic and it's not simplistic. It takes deep, prayerful reflection on what God has said about our salvation.
Well, listen, we're just about out of time. We had a few more questions we would have liked to have discussed, but we're not going to be able to get to them since we need to finish here in a few minutes. But Randy, thank you so much for coming and speaking, and I really appreciate your comments and your insights into Lewis and how he lived out his life and how we can gain from that, and then just the general discussion that we've had here on some very key events.
Can I throw in one last bit, Gary? Please, please. I don't want to ignore the fact that it's quite possible that some people who have tuned into this are checking out the Christian faith from the outside. They wouldn't necessarily consider themselves a Christian, or they're questioning, or they're wondering. And I'm really grateful if that is you and that you're tuning in. I want to point you to one resource on our website. It's just the cslewisinstitute.org/follow Jesus. And it's an invitation for someone on the outside to hear. Well, so what do we mean by this? I've made some assumptions tonight in my presentation. But if you want to find out more about that, please check out that link. I think we're going to put it in the chat. And please don't hesitate to contact us. Send us an email with your questions, and we'd love to interact with you and see how we can help you move forward in figuring out all of this kind of stuff. So thanks so much. It's been good to be with you.
Well, thank you, Randy, for adding that in. You've cut my comments back at the end here very significantly, so that'll work very good. But just to remind everybody, and I'll make the last few comments before we close out here, that the C.S. Lewis Institute is able to put on these live events due to the generosity of many people who've helped to financially support this ministry. And I'd like to ask you to, some of you who can able to do this, to prayerfully consider making a gift tonight. The information on how to do this will be on the screen following our broadcast. And also, the information on the publications and the programs of the C.S. Lewis Institute may be found in our website. Again, it's www.cslewisinstitute.org. And finally, for those out there who may find the Lord tugging on their hearts to try something that will really challenge them and help them to grow, I ask you to prayerfully consider participating in the Fellows Program. I believe it will greatly impact your life. So I pray now that all of us and our loved ones might have a blessed and holy Easter. And with that, I say good night and God bless.